co-chair of the Justice in Action Committee and is also on the coordinating committee of OSPN. She'd like to say a few words about what we do and why we decided to host the event tonight.
Thanks very much, Glenn. First of all, in terms of the sound system, how is that working okay for? Yes, good. If it isn't, just wave your hands in the air. That would really be helpful for us. So I'm really pleased to be here
Co-chair
tonight
of the
to help
Justice in
introduce
Action
the
Committee
Justice in Action,
and is also on the coordinating committee of OSPN. She'd like to say a few words about what we do and why we decided to host the event tonight.
And OSPN. Thanks
so
very much, Glenn.
A volunteer organization.
First of all, in terms of the sound system,
partnership
is
is
that
very close
working
ties
okay
with two
yes,
wonderful
good.
organizations.
If it isn't, just wave your hands in the air.
Health Center.
That would
and
really
the
be helpful for us.
Senior Center, both of whom, as organizations, really have supported.
I'm really pleased
the development of
Co-chair of the Justice in Action Committee and is also on the coordinating committee of OSPN. She'd like to say a few words about what we do and why we decided to host the event tonight.
Thanks very much, Glenn. First of all, in terms of the sound system, how is that working okay for? Yes, good. If it isn't, just wave your hands in the air. That would really be helpful for us. So I'm really pleased to be
co-chair of the Justice in Action Committee and is also on the coordinating committee of OSPN. She'd like to say a few words about what we do and why we decided to host the event tonight.
Thanks very much, Glenn. First of all, in terms of the sound system, how is that working okay for? Yes, good. If it isn't, just wave your hands in the air. That would really be helpful for us. So I'm really pleased to be
co-chair of the Justice in Action Committee and is also on the coordinating committee of OSPN. She'd like to say a few words about what we do and why we decided to host the event tonight.
Thanks very much, Glenn. First of all, in terms of the sound system, how is that working okay for? Yes, good. If it isn't, just wave your hands in the air. That would really be helpful for us. As organizations really have supported. So I'm really pleased to be
co-chair of the Justice in Action Committee and is also on the coordinating committee of OSPN. She'd like to say a few words about what we do and why we decided to host the event tonight.
Thanks very much, Glenn. First of all, in terms of the sound system, how is that working okay for? Yes, good. If it isn't, just wave your hands in the air. That would really be helpful for us. As organizations really have so I'm really pleased to
co-chair of the Justice in Action Committee and is also on the coordinating committee of OSPN. She'd like to say a few words about what we do and why we decided to host the event tonight.
Thanks very much, Glenn. First of all, in terms of the sound system, how is that working okay for? Yes, good. If it isn't, just wave your hands in the air. That would really be helpful for us. So I'm really pleased to
co-chair of the Justice in Action Committee and is also on the coordinating committee of OSPN. She'd like to say a few words about what we do and why we decided to host the event tonight.
Thanks very much, Glenn. First of all, in terms of the sound system, how is that working okay for? Yes, good. If it isn't, just wave your hands in the air. That would really be helpful for us. So I'm really pleased to
co-chair of the Justice in Action Committee and is also on the coordinating committee of OSPN. She'd like to say a few words about what we do and why we decided to host the event tonight.
Thanks very much, Glenn. First of all, in terms of the sound system, how is that working okay? Yes, good. If it isn't, just wave your hands in the air. That would really be helpful for us.
personal safety and the safety of your community friends and allies, above all else, in the unlikely event of a similarly organized disruption. Do not engage with someone speaking or behaving in a threatening manner. Sadly, this recent incident proves why a discussion like the one we're having here tonight is necessary in these challenging times. So with that out of the way, I can finally introduce you to our 5 featured panelists. So thank you very much for being patient with Holly and I. I'll introduce each of you by saying your name and give you some time to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about some of your community work, and why you were interested in participating as a panelist this evening. So we'll start to my far right, to your left, with Robert Alsbury.
I'm first. Ooh. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Robert Alsbury. I use he, him pronouns, and my accessibility needs have been met in this space. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. I presently work at Max Ottawa, which is a community-based nonprofit organization that focuses on holistic health and wellness for guys and to guys. I work there as the communications and outreach coordinator. I started there as a volunteer, then as a community maximizer, which is a microgrant program, and was able to begin a queer male discussion group called K1. So I have a very long relationship with Max. But I'm originally from United States, from Pittsburgh. I've been in Ottawa for the last 3 years. So part of my intersection of being in Ottawa is being new to the city, learning what it means to be a service provider, beginning relationships with our ally organizations that I work with at Max, that I use as a service provider, as a queer man, and yeah. And my background is a nurse. I'm a registered nurse. I was working here in the States before I moved here, and also learning on what it means to be a nurse in Ontario. So part of my intersection of being in Ottawa is being new to the city, learning what it means to be a service provider, beginning relationships with. Sure, it's MAX, Max Ottawa. No acronym.
Hi everyone, my name is Patricia Jin, and I have no idea why I'm here. I do use the pronoun she, and I have this to say about that. I define myself my entire life as an old school butch, and it is who I am, and it started here in Ottawa when I learned about the history of butches and their role in the community as protectors of a demonstration of strength and leadership. We continue to do that today, and often I get asked by some of the youth and straight allies, is, do you feel relevant anymore? And why do you dress the way you do? And what role do you play in today's community? My response to that is, I wear the term old school butch as a badge of honor. I walk the streets with great I say this with my heart, please don't forget us. As we grow and evolve and we have pronouns, I really want us to be remembered for what we have brought. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Faye Johnstone. I use she and they pronouns. I have been organizing, getting angry, using megaphones for a little while in Ottawa now. Thank you, Peter. I have been organizing Ottawa, or helping organize Ottawa's Trans March for about 2 years now, bringing it back after a few years when it wasn't happening. In terms of like the work that I do, I'm a writer with Daily Extra, so going into the media and getting angry. Again, I work for a social enterprise in Halifax called Wisdom to Action, helping do community engagement initiatives with social services and nonprofits, connecting them to communities, and trying to help uplift the voices of young folks or any communities that aren't really getting their voices heard at an organizational level, but also at a more systemic level. In terms of what interests me or excites me about this panel is I think there are very real intergenerational gaps in our communities. Coming out as like a trans feminine person in Ottawa, I didn't know any older, I didn't know many older trans women or trans folks in general. And I think that there's a loss in that. There's a loss in our communities that are not like co-located young folks or any communities that aren't really getting their voices heard at an organizational level, but also at a more systemic level. In terms of what interests me or excites me about this panel is I think there are very real intergenerational gaps in our communities. Coming out as like a trans feminine person in Ottawa, I didn't know any older, I didn't know many older trans women or trans folks in general. And I think that there's a loss in that. There's a loss in our communities that are not
who just have a lot of stigma and angst towards people of the queer community because their family, because of what they see in their peer groups. So I kind of deconstruct all of that and bring it really down to the roots, and it's work that I love doing. In Ottawa, I moved here about 3 years ago. I volunteered with Planned Parenthood Ottawa. I worked at the Morgentaler Clinic, and I just like to give a voice to marginalized people and try to help through education, because I think when you know better, you do better, and that's what I try to highlight in my educational pursuits. So I kind of deconstruct all of that and bring it really to the roots. It's work that I love doing.
Thank you very much, everyone, for introducing yourselves. I figure you can speak best of all the amazing work that you do, and I'm sure the audience now has a better understanding of the impact that you individually have had in the community, and what you do is very impressive. So thank you very much for being here tonight, and also for all the work that you do in the community. So we'll get started with our first question. We are nearing the 50th anniversary of the birth of queer rights in Canada. It started in 1971 with the We Demand protest that happened in Parliament Hill. So we did see from that time a community sort of grow out of nothing, out of a necessity of our rights not being recognized, to today, where we see a lot of those institutions, organizations, groups, businesses and bars and so on closing for many different factors. Things change and evolve in 50 years. So I'm going to make this a bit of a two-part question and divide this intergenerationally, I guess, and field the question first to the senior members of the panel. And I'm hoping that you can maybe talk a little bit about what this emergent community meant to you in that sort of early time of the movement, what you felt the benefits from sharing queer space were, if any, and what do you see as possible dangers in allowing our queer spaces to disappear?
I might be senior, I qualify. Back in the day, it was so much easier to find each other. You go to the bar and you were with your people. You go to Elgin Street here and you hung out at the bookstore, and sure enough, everybody you knew was coming down there, and you could find each other and developed relationships and failed relationships. And some really bad relationships. But eventually, we sort of became more normalized, because that is what we were fighting for, right? To be accepted for who we were. Maybe not their normal, but our normal. And I think the work that we did back then, when we marched up Parliament Hill, we marched up Elgin Street, we marched everywhere, and then we danced. And we danced, oh my God, we danced. But the thing we were really fighting for was that equality. And as I've watched, not just Elgin Street, but Church Street, or whatever street that we had in our towns disappear, and watched our communities integrate into Westboro or Orleans or whatever, I somewhat applaud that, because it's what we wanted to do. We wanted to be more normal, but then we lost sight of each other. And so, that is a struggle for me. I lost my wife 5 years ago. We were in a relationship for 19 years. And when I lost her, I had no idea how to find my people. We had moved to a small town. I knew nobody. And it was heartbreaking for me not to just lose my glue, but to not have my community. And I can't tell you how wonderful it is for me to be in this room today. What I have found, and I just remembered why I'm here. This is really good. Hold on.
Senior moment.
How long have I got? You may have seen my picture in the Picton newspaper. So after going through transformation from being in a 19-year relationship to being single and figuring out who the hell I am without Tony, I sat on my couch and I read this newsreel from the local Catholic church who said, congregation members should not attend gay pride events because it will lead our children away from the teachings of God. And I was sad, and then I was enraged. And that rage came from my community in Ottawa, where I learned that that's not right, and we're going to march. We're going to do something. And so I went down there in all my best rage, and I integrated, and I attended this group of people. I had no idea who they were, but 70% of them were allies. I was stunned stupid and so happy to have all of these allies show up there with their children, drawing on the sidewalks. We had collared clergy there, we had teachers there, and it was so gay, somebody was going around with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. And I thought, these are my people. But I stood in that crowd and I looked up at the church doors, those big oak doors that were closed to me, and I thought, that's wrong. And I walked up the steps as I had been taught to walk up the steps right here in Ottawa, the steps of the Parliament buildings. I walked up the steps of that small church and I took action by simply greeting the parishioners to church. And it went nuts. The three horsemen came out of the church to bully and intimidate me off those steps. I could go on, but let me just say I didn't move. I did not move. And when it became clear to them that I was not engaging with them, as the moderators have talked today, do not engage, I closed my mind to them and continued to greet the people. And he said to me, with his eyes bulging out of his head, I'm going to get the police and I'm going to have you arrested. And I said, I welcome that. And he went into the crowd and he returned shortly with the only lesbian police officer in 100 miles. It did not go well for him that day, but I'm telling you, I'm going off on a rant here. I'm telling you that 50 years ago, I would have been dragged down those stairs. I would have been taken to some beach in some dark corner and I would have been beaten. And I'm sure people here have experienced that, but not now. The allies were there, and we took that small town action, we turned it into regional action, we presented a deputation to the council, which was fully adopted to work towards making Prince Edward County a sanctuary community for the 2S LGBT community, and I have found community there. And I'm just so excited about how to greet, welcome, and be with our allies, and to experience that we're okay. There's nothing wrong with us, and they love us. And I want to be able to celebrate them as well, and celebrate them within the work that we do. We need them, they need us. I've talked enough.
Thank you, Patricia. Ben, did you have anything to add from your experience? And Patricia tells an engaging story, and it might be a hard act to follow, but I was curious about your experiences in terms of what community meant to you, and what perhaps losing spaces means to you now.
I can't say a whole lot about having a queer community because I transitioned in 1995. I was an ally, and I'll always be an ally, but my experience of the queer community was very different for that reason. I can speak a little bit about, I mentioned earlier, I've spoken with a few people who I know who are in the community who are trans, and a lot of them miss a physical space to meet. They miss a physical space to learn about other people. And one of the main messages I'd like to get across tonight is the importance of learning about the experiences and perspectives of the people in this room, of the people who congregate, of community, whatever that means for you. People are missing the opportunities and having a space to chat with their peers, learn about others, participate in activities that are beyond, and there's nothing wrong with these activities, but they don't always want to play cards and go to dances. They want to do other things. I spoke with some senior trans people who are saying there's nothing for senior trans people or people who are gender diverse. So a physical location, and people don't know what's happening. We don't have Capital Extra anymore. We don't have Go Info. Where do we learn about the events that we missed last time again because we didn't know where to look, yeah. So the physical space, a communication mechanism, those are the things that I hear people are needing and desperately needing. And linking that to alienation, to isolation, to loneliness, it's a very, very sadly, a very common experience these days.
Thank you. That's great, Ben. And you mentioned one word that, in my experience working with the Village Legacy Project and interviewing a lot of seniors, that came up again and again in conversation was isolation. I think that's something that's very important, and I hear that a lot. I probably don't engage as much with youth as I would like to, but I do hear that word being used by youth today as well, because, as you say, spaces are sort of hard to find, which leads me to asking some of the younger people in the panel what community means to younger generations, as we seem to be moving more towards virtual spaces than physical ones. And do you see any value in maintaining physical spaces? And then what does that look like to you? Like what kinds of, if for example, the spaces that sort of emerged out of the 70s, the bars, the sort of community groups and whatnot, are not necessarily speaking to what youth need now. What kinds of spaces are of value to youth?
I appreciate being on the youthful side.
I got shoes older than you.
I'm in a middle ground. I've recently turned 40, which I am in love with. And so I feel kind of in the middle of this question. One thing that's been commented about people who grew up in the 80s is we were the last generation of kids to go out and play, and a last generation in which we blended technology with socialization. We had the only Atari on the street, so all the kids came to our house and played. So we had to figure that out together. And I see that impact in which, when I first started going to queer spaces, which was pre-Grindr, and I think pre-gay.com. So I think that was like a little couple years later. So, still in that time period of being forced to having to socialize and make those connections. So it's interesting being, I guess, middle-aged, for lack of a better word, and being able to see the differences in how my queer elders, connected different from where I see where 20-year-olds are now. Not just loss of queer spaces, but you really see where they're much more dependent on technology, so that loss of social skills altogether, because they have a lot more conversations about just how to make friends or how to make connections, or do I have a personality outside of watching TV shows and things like that. But I think also to answer the second part of that question, there's a lot of reasons why we're losing queer spaces. Gentrification, some are, Grindr, Tinder, things like that. But I think also what's really problematic is that a lot of queer spaces are owned by white, older, cis males. And I think what you're seeing too is also a lack of, speaks to a lot of issues of why we're having this panel tonight, because we're seeing lots of queer spaces because we're seeing a lack of wanting to adapt and change, wanting to keep spaces in a certain space and time and not opening it up to other folks. And so ensuring that those spaces become safer for a wider variety of people, our queer folks living with accessibility issues, our trans family members. Yeah, and I think that's something that really is sad and also needs to be addressed and unpacked, because what we're seeing is that youth aren't going to necessarily queer spaces because they don't feel safe there. And the owners of those queer spaces, and rather than having to change and adapt and grow and expand definitions of community, are just finding it easier to close and sell those businesses and move on.
I'm going to answer the first part of that question, or the second part of that question first. I think we definitely need like physical locations. I think that virtual spaces have an immense amount of value, and I think they are allowing folks who, especially like younger folks who are isolated, to connect with other people like them online, to find that commonality, particularly when young folks are coming out and going through those first steps. I think the sense of community folks can access through some of those digital spaces is like beyond value. But I also think that we are like losing those local physical spaces. I worked at Venus Envy Ottawa as a sex educator and retail clerk, and it was a very clear demonstration of one of those spaces, because as other spaces have closed or didn't feel accessible to folks for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it was, like a lot of young folks don't want to go to a bar and have to be like in a clubbing scene. They might want a sober space. They might want to just like hang out with their pals and do their thing. A lot of the folks ended up actually coming to Venus Envy. I found more often than not. We had folks visiting the shop just because they wanted to like be in a gay space and like hang out and see the gay pride flags and look at the rainbow dildos. And so I think that like we need those physical spaces. I think now a lot of them are happening on kind of like a chaotic level. And so like people go out to rallies, people go out to marches and community gatherings, but we are bad at communicating about those. We're bad at getting the word out to folks who aren't already part of our like very cliquey social circles. If you don't know a trans person who does a rally, you will not go to that rally because you won't know that it's happening. And so I think we are bad at that like broader communication. And I think we are bad at, again, like bringing those younger folks into those spaces with older folks to, again, have some of those conversations and learn some of those lessons. I keep coming back to it, but I would have loved when I first came out and realized what it's like to exist in this world looking like I do. I would have loved older trans women or trans feminine folks to like talk to me about how they dealt with street harassment. Talk to me about how they dealt with surviving when people are staring at you. Like, how do you deal with some of those concrete things? Because there's lessons learned there that can combat isolation. And I think a lot of young folks are still feeling, particularly trans folks, but also like people of any gender, cis or trans, are still feeling the brunt of that violence that is embedded in our society. And it's exhausting to deal with that every day. And I don't think all that many know, how do you deal with that? Like, how do you actually survive that 10 years? Because it's depressing when you think about the horizon that you are, like the life that you're going into, always going hand in hand with that violence. And so I think that learning is crucial. And on that note, I am going to run to the washroom.
Thanks, Faye.
Yeah, so I'm going to just talk about, let's talk about community first and online communities. So I work with youth all the time, and the idea is that online communities can be great because you can find somebody who identifies specifically as you and talk to them, right? So it's that idea if you're a non-binary, pansexual, gray sexual, right? You can say, oh, I can find my community and that exact community. But it's the idea that I feel that is lost in online communities is the fact that what happens when we're living in homogenous spaces where we don't have the differences in opinions and ideas and values that can come in a community space, right? So I think that is the one thing that I think gets alienated in online communities is that sense of back and forth that we can create in our own community when we're socializing with people who don't look like us and don't always act like us and have different viewpoints, and we can discuss and we can argue and we can have discussion and we can create friendship. And that is the one thing that I think we're losing, and physical space can help do that. And that's what I tried to facilitate in every workshop that I do, is getting kids together and not just teaching them, but getting them to talk to each other and learn about each other, because that is its own support groups. You know, as adults, we go to support groups and we talk about how we felt as we were teenagers, and the feelings of, oh, I didn't feel like I was part, or, I didn't think that this, and then people say, yeah, me too. I do that kind of thing, that support group that I call one of my workshops AA for kids, because I literally just sit them all in a circle and get them to talk about their identity, and then have that moment of being like, who feels that way too, and then having everyone realize, oh yeah, me too. So that can only really be created and be comfortable, I think, in physical space sometimes, because you're taking up space, you're holding space for each other. So yeah.
Can I add a little
Thanks very
something to
much.
this, Glenn? Can I add a little something?
of course.
In Prince Edward County, one of the things we did achieve was we set up a Facebook group called PEC Alliance. Mark that down. It is a collection of alliances within the PEC county, and it's a space for them to share events, have discussions, and mentor each other, and just share the information. And it is a place where we can meet, and we invite everyone to participate. The other thing that I've done as a result of this is I've asked a 20-year-old butch to mentor me, because I really want to learn about the issues that they face today. I don't want to spend a lot of time reminiscing and telling war stories about my life. I want to hear what they face today and how we can help each other and how we can grow through this. And I encourage every senior member here to find a youth and ask them to mentor you, because they'll really help you set up your Facebook page really well.
I had two other thoughts, and I think, so one of them that came to mind is, I think that when we I'll talk about like physical locations, when I look at like LGBTQ charities in Ottawa, most of them barely have 2 staff. I think about the fact that most of them are struggling to pay rent. Most of them are struggling to like actually have the staff to create those physical spaces. And so I think there's an issue there around advocacy, around being more intentional about our asks to the funders, whoever they might be, because we often forget about like the small nonprofits, but those small nonprofits, when the businesses are shutting down, could actually step into that role and could provide those services and create those spaces. And a lot of them do. Kind Space offers like very popular like youth programming on Wednesdays and Friday nights. We have a group by and for trans young people in this city called Safety Ottawa, who are doing that work and connecting communities. But at the end of the day, there is a dollar value there. There is a dollar value of like these organizations need the funding to do that work. And another thing that I just want to touch on very briefly is I think one of the issues that we see, or that I see in the difference between younger and older LGBTQ folks is, I know that I get caught up in this idea that we live in such a good world now. I get caught up, and like I hear that. I have talked to older trans folks, I've talked to older LGBTQ folks, and I love the fact that when you look at your world today, you can do things that you never could have done before. That you can go on the steps of a church, and that you will not worry about your physical safety in that moment necessarily. But I also know that I worry about my physical safety when I leave the house. I worry about my physical safety, and the people that I am connected to worry about their physical safety every day. There are not tons of trans women or trans feminine folks who go out in public, like full stop. They don't leave their houses because they're worried about the risk if they leave their houses. I think people mistake the fact that we have some very visible trans people in this community some of the time, and they don't realize that it is exhausting to be visible, and that there's a risk in that visibility because you do not know, and I'm not talking about like media visibility, I'm talking visibility in being visibly gender nonconforming. I don't think folks realize how difficult that can be, and that that is not the reality of our broader communities because they would rather stay inside and not risk that violence. So yeah.
Thank you. That's a really, really important point, and I'm really glad that you raised that, Faye. I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of what you've mentioned a few. Some of you have mentioned a few organizations that do exist. I'm curious about those, just so that for people who maybe aren't aware of their services, what they do, if they're feeling marginalized, isolated, how they can reach out to those groups. So that's open to anyone who wants to answer that one.
Max Ottawa has some really great services.
Let me tell you about them, Faye. To start with is that Max Ottawa, we recently completed our strategic plan of 2019 to 2022, maxottawa.ca/directions. You can see our video and full report. But one thing that was interesting for me being a part of it, and I know as well as for my colleagues and the board, is what was really resonated is that in consulting the community and listening to our service users, is that there was a lot of need for just basic services, not anything complex, but just how do you find a doctor? How do you navigate these really basic systems? And also, how do you find social spaces that aren't bar-based, right? That don't have alcohol? And I think that it was interesting that we were overwhelmed by how simple the requests that the communities were. But that being said, one thing that I'm really proud of personally and professionally with Max is that we've created an environment in which a lot of community members from various backgrounds and intersections using our services feel very safe. And so that's something that we've really obviously cherish and work hard to keep intact. But in terms of programs and services, we have an arts and crafts group that meets once a month. As I mentioned, we have a Black Queer Male discussion group that meets twice a month. We have, in partnership with the Ottawa Senior Pride Network, Now What, we have a 40-plus discussion group that meets once a month. Those have been our part of our regular programming. We also have our Maximizer programs in which community members can submit ideas. And so those pilot projects have been really successful as well. We've had gay Muslim cooking nights. There's a gay Francophone party that we fund once a year that happens. And so a lot of things to say about that, but it's also really interesting of how we're talking about programs and really meaningful spaces that have been started with just $250 to $500, $1,000, so small amounts of money that have been really impactful. And one thing, speaking about using our Black Queer Male discussion group, keeping it 100 for an example of what we're talking about, is that it's been consistent. It's been ongoing for a year and a half. So the group's been able to be visible, build trust in the community. We've seen numbers grow because of that, because seeing something that's permanent and ongoing has helped people know that this is a space and an organization that can be trusted. It's not something that's just popping up here and there, so consistency is also important. And it's also been interesting that it's all ages. I think there's a lot of great youth programming, which is amazing and it's needed. But sometimes, after you're kind of 25 to 29-ish, you become that lost child. Unfortunately, there's a lot of great services for seniors, still lacking, but still there. And I think it's been interesting in keeping that group all ages, and how that also creates intergenerational dialogue that doesn't always occur.
Awesome, thank you. Paul, I think you were motioning to me that you might have a question. Is that true?
We did get a question from David Das. Roughly 100 services, orgs. Is there value in an effort helping to host a symposium with those groups to see how to better support, provide visibility and connectedness across those groups and orgs?
Yes.
Sorry, did everyone hear that question, or we're good? Okay.
I think, I don't know if there has ever been a time where we've actually done like a town hall, like a gathering of open session around LGBTQ communities in Ottawa and asked them, what are your priorities? What are the issues that you're seeing? And what do you want done about it? And I think something like that also engaged particular demographics in closed conversations. So let seniors have conversations amongst themselves, let trans folks, let Black LGBTQ folks, let folks with disabilities, like those kinds of conversations to start actually taking the pulse of what are the issues that we need to address and what are the ones that aren't even on our broader radars, because we know that the needs of our broader communities are very different from the needs of particular sections of that community. And so I think a space for those discussions, ideally a recurring space, would add immense value and help us actually come up with an agenda. Because I don't think we have one in Ottawa. I don't think we know what we need, because I don't think we're having the conversations across generations and across communities to be strategic and intentional around addressing those gaps. So yes.
As far as providing resources, so I work for CCJC, as I said, as an education coordinator. There is no place that I won't do a workshop at. If there is somewhere in your workplace, if there is somewhere in your community, whether it is your church or someone that you just work with, I will go and I will talk to those people, because I feel like education is important. So providing that resource, and for free providing that resource to people, is important so that they can receive the education that we need. On our website, we have lots of resources, posters, things like that that can be printed out and people can use for themselves. And just reaching out to educators or people, if you want to know more, reaching out to someone from any of the organizations that we're part of and saying, hey, I wanted to know more on this subject, and then we will go out and look and find these things for you, whether it's wanting to get more LGBTQ reading material or things like that. Venus Envy is amazing because they have so many educational services and information that they can give for folks. And I say kind space, kind space, kind space so much, and every day. It is such an amazing community organization. Just creating physical space and creating community for our community. And I think I just can't say enough good things about them. And they share their space with Planned Parenthood Ottawa. So it's the duality of like creating that community with sexual health and reproductive rights as well. So I think it's really important that people know about those community organizations as well.
I live in a somewhat rural area, so I spend a lot of time on the internet. There are no spaces. I mean, as I said, Picton, which is a very open area, is 45 minutes away from me. And I know a lot of the older lesbians that I spend time with, and older queers, are feeling a little safer online. Not that that's necessarily accurate, but it is just how we are finding and communicating with each other. One of the things we want to do with the PEC Alliance is actually bring all of that information together, send it out, and we are also wanting to challenge the businesses within our community about the programs that they're all putting in place that don't include us, or you. And so we're not just asking, we're going to demand a presence there. We have to demand it. I can't sit and wait. I'm 66 years old and I've got some critical illnesses. I need to be able to find a space. And as we age, we do need to be able to look each other in the eye and just be with each other. And so I encourage everyone to find whatever means you can. And online has been challenging. I've spent a little time on Plenty of Fish. It didn't go well.
Trust me, Grindr's no better.
I don't think I would.
You'll have to find that youth mentor to help you find the right spaces there.
And also, I'm sorry.
That's a good segue. In terms of health, one of the things I've been doing for the last couple of years is volunteering with the Ottawa Hospital. And I got involved with them. I was on a panel presentation talking about my experiences in the hospital as a trans person. And some of it wasn't great. And I was invited to sit on it's called a Patient and Family Advisory Committee. You may not have heard of that term. You'll probably hear more about it. I think more and more hospitals are involving patients in their own care and asking patients what their experiences are so they can learn how to better treat their patients. So that is happening. One of the things I'm pushing for is to have a committee that's dedicated to the LGBT community. They have a corporate level PFAC, so it's sort of a high level, and there are different condition specific PFACs. So there's one for cancer, there's one for mental health, or you name the condition, and there's probably a PFAC for that. So I've been pushing for them to get a PFAC for people who are LGBT. So if people here have had bad experiences in the hospital or really good experiences, let them know they're interested in hearing what patients have to say, and I can attest to their willingness to learn about that. So there's an opportunity there for people who, if you want to get involved at that level, in terms of building partnerships, which is I think where we're going with this, there may be some opportunities there.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to ask one question, and I'm going to ask this to the panel, but also to the audience as well, because what we'll do is we'll open it up at this point to audience questions. I'm going to try and use the cordless mic, which we know is unfortunately not the best, so but I'll go around the room and try and get to your questions as you have them. But the question I was curious about, really with everyone in the room, and online as well, if people have some questions there, is in terms of social or service spaces in Ottawa, you've certainly mentioned some great spaces, but what, in your opinion, are things that are currently lacking? Like you're hearing from the clients and people that you meet when you're doing your workshops and so on. What are they telling you in terms of things that are missing in the community?
Biggest things, the thing about living in an old city is that infrastructure is an issue because there's a lack of buildings that are accessible, that are inclusive, that have gender-neutral washrooms. If they are accessible, are the washrooms accessible with a wheelchair? Are major concerns. And then the second part is transportation. Particularly folks living in the suburbs, how do they access resources, especially ones that are downtown, and not all organizations have the funds to assist in that manner. And I would say third is, once again, going back to trust in those organizations. There's a lot of, and rightfully so, a lot of trauma, you know. Unfortunately, cis folks have not always been the most welcome to trans folks. And so I think sometimes is that we are always asking folks in a marginalized group to do the work of coming into the spaces, but we really need to reverse that and ask ourselves, like, what can we do as cis folks, or, being a person of color, I don't always trust spaces that are white. So I think the folks in the majority really need to have asked themselves honest questions about what they can do to ensure that those spaces are safe.
I think the list of gaps would take us a few hours to get through. But one of the things that I have noticed is, so I do a lot of LGBTQ education with service providers. I do a lot of child and mental health agencies, shelters organizations. If they will bring me in, I will give them a spiel. And a lot of it is trans-specific these days. But what I've noticed is a lot of organizations just stop at the workshop. And they do, an hour, hour and a half, maybe if you're lucky. And then they're like, all right, our staff know how to talk to gay people. We are good to go. And so one of the biggest gaps that I have noticed and that I try to fill in my small ways is we don't have programs to not only give the LGBTQ 101, but also to provide ongoing mentorship and support. To think intentionally about how do you take an organization's culture that has been set in its ways for probably decades on end, and then how do you shift it in those small ways that make LGBTQ inclusion very fundamental to their policy and their practice. There are examples of organizations that are doing that. I was training the Youth Services Bureau's team today around a pronoun policy, and so they've implemented this policy that holistically ensures that staff know, respect, and abide by the identified pronouns of their clients, and that is a big step in that direction. But they had to come up with that policy from scratch. Because I don't think there was another example I know of in Ottawa where an organization has created a pronoun policy, let alone outside of Ottawa. And so I think we need to be we don't have the funding or the kinds of programs in place that hold organizations' hand through that process, and that also make sure that it's not a cost to the organization, but a add-on to what they already have in place. And so I think that if we could do that intentionally with every nonprofit, social service, and health organization in the city, that would be a game changer, but no one even can tell me what agencies have received training this year, what agencies haven't received training in a decade, and what organizations are really doing that work right, and how can we leverage those successes.
I might have a little story. I worked for the City of Toronto in long-term care. I worked for the city for years before that, but in this particular instance, they were starting to make big deals about the raising of the flag for Pride Week. And as City of Toronto institutions, we would raise the flag. And I thought, fan-fucking-tastic. I will be out there, we'll all be out there, we'll raise the flag and we'll celebrate together. So I went out there at noon and I was the only person out there, except for my staff person, raising the flag. And although I was disappointed, I thought, next year this is going to be different. So I spent the year putting our issues on the table at staff meetings, at whatever way that I could. I was as out as I could be, and I was asking questions all the time about, what about our gay residents, our queer residents? Well, how are we serving them? Do they feel safe here? And the next year, I made them get a bus. And we filled the bus with residents and water guns. And we went in the Toronto Gay Parade, or Pride Parade. They had the time of their lives. And we had a much stronger presence. And I guess the moral of this story is, we have to make it at the table. We've got to be there. We've got to raise our voices. Don't wait for them to bring it up. I can tell you, in long-term care, I would rather kill myself because I've worked there. I know how dangerous a place it is for us. Don't be fooled for a moment by the pretty ads that you see. It's not safe. But we can change that. And I know Ottawa is working on that. You're doing educational stuff, you're presenting training. That has to happen. And there has to be accountability to them about why they're not doing it. That's my story.
I think as well having, when it comes to decision-making rooms, having spaces that look like the panel here, that is diverse and gender diverse, that is racially diverse, when we're making decisions, because a lot of the time we say things like, well, I want this space to be accessible for marginalized folks, but we don't have any marginalized folks at the table making these decisions. So I think that is the biggest way that we can create change. Rather than saying, oh, I want to help these people, saying, this is how you can help our community. Because I feel like when we leave that out, then even the best of intentions can never be as fully capable as they can when we bring people into the conversation. And especially when it comes to ability, when it comes to age, and all of those things, we can't just say we want this to be for everyone and think that it actually will be. We need to bring everyone in to make the decision.
So, does the panel have anything else? I'll take it to the audience if there are any questions. We're good? Okay, I'm gonna run over and grab that crummy mic. Bear with me. Does anyone have any questions before I run over? Oh, Jay does? Okay. Excuse me for crossing across the room.
I actually have quite a few questions, but I'm going to try and stick to a few of them. But I'd like to make some comments. I really love your story, Patricia, but the one I didn't love was that's what we wanted, to be normal. And when you said that, yeah, when you said that, is we need to be able to accept ourselves as we are, and we don't need to adapt to be more normalized. So just wanted to make that comment. And you know, I'm going to be 66 too, and I have similar fears to you. And I've also lived with HIV for over 35 years, and I'm very alive. But I'm terrified of the home care services if I require it, because no one's training home care people that there are different types of families, there are different types of gender, there are different types of sexual orientation. And if they do get the training, it's the fastest turnover of staff that you've ever seen. So it has to be consistent. You can't just do it once. And I know that from many of the caregivers that I've talked to, you know. Oh yeah, Bruce House came in and did a talk on HIV, you know, so we're cool. And you're right, afterwards it's not. Okay, my real question is, being a long-time activist, right from the beginning of university until now, over 45 years, I'm at which we can develop more of an alliance of people to not only deal with the fact that we're living in a terrifying world right now, and that some of the rights that people at the table haven't received, but maybe I've received, might be taken away. And how do we work towards protecting what we've got, but bringing the people who have not benefited from some of these rights, how do we bring them in, and how do we be able to say, we're not your enemy, we've got some experience here. And if I'm a white cis male, a gay male, privilege, and I know, don't diss me, or how can I help? How can my privilege help you? You know, do you need me to or for you? Because I've done long time advocacy. So what do we do? How do we change our language? How do we get youth to and people of color to come to the table and be unified and have healthy discussions? Because, you know, this is not going to cut it just all by itself. So my question really is to the diverse, more marginalized peoples, how can we become allies? If not allies, can I be an accomplice? You know, because I really do know that there are trust issues here too. So how do we overcome that?
Can I just respond by saying long-term care is overregulated and underfunded. So when I talk about the fact that it's a dangerous place to be for anyone who's marginalized, it is all dangerous for our allies as well. There's a lot of abuse that goes on within that system, and we've seen the reports. What was that woman, that nurse's name that was recently just found for murdering 7 seniors in her care? There's so much abuse within the system, and people don't, the turnaround I think is related to the fact that there's no resources. It's a hellish job that they do for a little bit of money, and overregulated. So again, we're the people now that are going to be using that system. We have to be more demanding about it. So I hope that just adds a little bit to your issue. I know I'm not answering your question, but I'm gonna leave that to somebody else.
Oh no, go ahead. You want to go? Oh.
I just wanted to mention that the Ottawa Senior Pride Network has a training team. I was a part of that training team for a couple of years, and we go into senior serving organizations and help the staff become familiar with the language around LGBT issues and sometimes just recognize that they might have residents or clients who are LGBT. And we usually try to have at least a 3-hour block of time to meet, to speak with the staff, and we put them through case studies and that kind of thing. Sometimes it's a one-off, sometimes we don't go back, and I agree, there's a lot of turnover in organizations, and I think it's important for people to know that some of that education is happening. To your second point, I think this is the beginning of something that could be really amazing, this panel and the people who took the time to come here tonight. And I have no doubt that the organizers are hoping that this leads to concrete something.
I think what's really important, I think what's really important is calling people in, right? And how do we do that is so you've taken the step to, for instance, acknowledge your privilege. We all take the moments to acknowledge our privilege. But then we kind of live the onus onto the people who are marginalized to reach out to us and try to create bonds with us. I think part of realizing your privilege is taking the time to then say, how can I reach out to these people that I want to help support, and what can I do to best help you, right? Because I think it's the idea of, especially when calling people in, because we have a culture that is a call-out culture, and calling people out can be great. Sometimes it can create change, but it can also create distance between our communities, right? And that's not what we want to do. We want to bring people in, and I love this quote. It says, if you don't heal your wounds, you'll bleed over people who never cut you. And I think that is super important when we're talking about building bonds, is saying that, although I may not feel safe in every queer white space, I have the openness to want to become feeling more safe in these spaces, probably as you. I'm open, but if no one is calling me in or creating programming or creating events that include people in my community, then I'm less likely to seek that out, right? So if we actually just reach out to the folks that we feel are being marginalized rather than making them have to reach out to us, I think that can create such a great unifying community between all of us. Right?
I recently had someone ask me that they recently took on a position of leadership in an organization and said, I really want to help Black people. They were not Black themselves. What can I do? And my instant response was, you need to step down and ensure that your job goes to a Black person. So I think making sure that the people that we want to help, not just, as you eloquently put, deciding when it's best to call in and call out, but also making sure that the folks that we want to help are getting into positions of leadership, are getting paid for their time, because oftentimes we're asking already marginalized folks to come in and volunteer and do things for free, and that doesn't put food on the table. That doesn't make people feel empowered to want to assist and to help. So I think that's a call out for all of us in positions of leadership to make sure that we're doing that, empowering folks to want to participate and help with us. But I also think, to speak broadly to a second point about, oftentimes, us as individuals, as queer people, us as the organizations that we work for and work with, oftentimes we're looking up for solutions, and I think it's unique, particularly in a Canadian context, of which there is a culture of things working in silos, of forgetting to look around and look at all of the amazing work that's being done, and also looking behind and seeing who's being left behind. I don't have the solution to that. That's obviously a broader conversation. But I think it also goes back to the question that we had from online. There's a lot of LGBTQ organizations, but we're not speaking to each other for a lot of reasons, interorganizational trauma, and there's also a lot of organizations, right? So it's not possible to speak to each other. So how do we find ways to synergize, to collaborate, to increase the capacity that we have? And I think that's what's really been interesting for me working at Max, being that we have a specific mandate, which is guys into guys. And so I think one of the benefits of that is that it kind of forces us into having to collaborate, right? Because we're certainly, if anyone comes to me, regardless of how they identify, I need to make sure that I'm aware of the resources that are available that they need. Yeah, just awareness and making sure that we're empowering folks.
I think to me, I've said this already, this is a start to those conversations. I think a lot of the time those are intergenerational conversations that haven't happened sufficiently, particularly when it comes to, again, sharing from, again, like the activism that folks did 50 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, particularly among young folks. A lot of, I'm not even counting myself on this, but a lot of young folks have only been around in our organizing scenes for 3 months or 6 months. A lot of folks who do organizing work burn out in 6 months. There's almost every year, Slut Walk Ottawa is organized by a different group of people. Almost every year, Transmarch, a lot of the time, there's a lot of burnout that happens there. And so finding ways to learn from older folks around how do you keep doing this? I think is really valuable. I think also, again, investing in those relationships with those communities and staying consistent in those relationships, even when you mess up. A lot of the time when I talk with organizations, they are actually very afraid to do LGBT or trans-specific work because they're so worried that they'll make a mistake. And then when they make a mistake, they say, oh God, we burned that bridge, we are never going back. And it actually stops organizations from doing that work. And so staying when you have fucked up, having those honest conversations and doing the learning, I think is crucial. But I also think that those messy privilege versus oppression conversations are also conversations we're bad at having even within our communities and even within silos of those communities. The trans community is not monolithic. My experiences are very different from experiences of Black trans folks, but also very different from experiences of white trans men. Right? The way that we exist, those are conversations that I think we're afraid to have. I think that we're very comfortable talking about the ways that we are oppressed, but we're very uncomfortable talking about the ways that we are privileged. And in this community, I think that we dive towards the ways in which we are oppressed and focus on those as opposed to focusing and also unpacking the ways in which the privileges that we have fundamentally shape our access to services, our access to safety in public, and that the ways in which those privileges shape us differ based off other marginalized experiences, but are not erased by those experiences.
Thank you. I know Peter has a question. I see some more hands coming up. I'm just looking at the time. It's pushing 8:30, and we do have a whole host of other questions. So I'm just going to maybe pass to one and maybe one or more. But if I could just ask you to be brief. When you do speak into the mic, just speak really close to the mic because we're having trouble hearing. We know it's a not so great mic. And maybe just for the panelists too, maybe just one of you could answer the question. I know that everyone wants to talk because they're really interesting questions, but I'm just looking at the time and worried about that. So thank you.
Hi, Peter Zanetti, activist since 1979. A question to Robert and Daniela in particular, in terms of the term pinkwashing. We've heard that term before, where organizations come and take the photo op and you don't see them ever again. I guess it refers particularly because you both work for organizations, and if I see a logo from a supporting organization or a sponsor, what insurances are those organizations who are supporting you or sponsoring you safe and inclusive as you are? Because I don't know. Do I have to go and click on their website to see if they are? Do you have a standards of when your organization are applying to you to be sponsorship or et cetera, to ensure that they are safe and inclusive as you are? Because that they're hanging your hat on your and they will probably put your logo on their website saying, hey, we're safe and inclusive. And I don't know sometimes. And it's sort of it leads itself to pinkwashing sometimes when we don't see it explicitly. So that's my question to you.
I can answer that question just I'm going to speak to myself and how I feel about my education, especially when I'm doing education. And for instance, we have a program called Proud City. So anyone who wants to be part of Proud City gets a Proud City sticker. So as our organization is moving forward with our new ED and the change in our organization, I feel like it's creating this time where I can say, this is exactly what I want. And for instance, with Proud City, no one is allowed to say that they are a member of Proud City any longer unless they come to do our training. So it was either training that was done on 2 separate days, and then I will continually over the year go to the folks and train all of their staff or a portion of their staff. And that's something that we want to move forward with. If you're going to be saying, hey, this is CCGSD, I've received my, I am an ally, and CCGSD came to help support our community, it's because we came and we did the work and we do the follow-up work. Currently, right now, I'm working with the Family Doulas of Ottawa, and we are looking to make them more inclusive, and that is something that I am working on a project with them that will be happening in the next few months, and it's taking the time to not just look and say, oh, well, you know, these are the families that we want to see. I say, how can this be inclusive? And I want it to be on your website, I want it to be in the mission statement, I want it to be down to the pronouns that you use in your intake forms, making sure that there are many tiers that are being crossed off when we talk about what does it mean to be inclusive, because I find that when it comes to even diversity, I don't want to be tokenized. I don't want our organization to be tokenized. As a person who is tokenized on many occasions, I want to make sure that when we say that we're doing something, that we're doing it, and that we're doing it wholeheartedly and as best we can.
Thank you. That's great. I'm over here now, and I'm with Joanne. I'll pass the mic to Joanne.
Happy Pride, everybody. My name is Joanne Law. I came out 40 years ago. You didn't do this 40 years ago. Identify myself as a transgendered woman. I've been through hell. I've been around the block more than twice. And I've seen the change we have in our community through Pride. I guess I'm one of the lucky ones to survive my identity. I got beat up. I lost my job. Wonderful thing to do when you're transgender, to lose your job. And then trying to get a lawyer who's going to support you and fight for you as a human rights issue. I lost everything. I lost my family. I lost my income. Lost my job, and I lived on welfare and soup kitchens as a transgendered woman. Wonderful experience. But today I'm free. Well, I think I'm at. There's so much stuff going on in the schools now about gender identity, gender expression. It's wonderful. Who's going to teach it? Who's going to teach it? The real issue, and not what someone's stories that set of storytelling. So I just want to thank the Seniors Pride Network for putting this panel together. And I love to see the transgendered folks in the audience and on the panel and everything else, because it's helps me deal with who the shit I'm going to be, you know? And yes, I am getting old. I don't ever want to go into a residence. I'm turning 75 this year. I know it's old, but I'm doing it. It's got to be the hormones or something. But I have a 2-bedroom apartment, and I said, my kids, if I ever get sick, one of the bedrooms will become an infirmary, because I'm never going to go to a residence. So I just want to let you know that I've seen the community build. I've seen the community build again. I've seen the community. And one of the issues is that we're all getting old. Do I have to go to this next meeting? We're all getting old. I don't ever want to get old. I don't ever want to get sick. So it's my point of view. I'm seeing what's happening in the community. Thank you to the Seniors Pride Network. And it's awesome, awesome, awesome. Happy Pride.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to, I know that there are some other questions, and I'm assuming there are some questions online as well. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but as I say, it is 8:30 now, so I'm going to get to another one of the questions that I had for the panel, if you would excuse me for that. Okay, so I'm back to the better mic. I wanted to talk a bit about some of the gains with all the gains that the community has made in regards to human rights and mainstream tolerance, if not acceptance, we also know that there are many who are still facing a variety of challenges in the community. And I'm curious if people could speak on what their thoughts were on sort of current ongoing issues that the queer community needs to champion in terms of, for example, intersectional groups that have unique challenges to overcome. And then also, I'm going to put two questions in one, if that's okay, just again for time, and talk a bit about what Jay had brought up about some of the right-wing extremism that we're seeing happening. As I mentioned earlier, there was the incident in Bell's Corners where a drag queen story time was interrupted by a right-wing extremist. We've seen similar incidents in Hamilton, in Toronto, Vancouver, or sorry, Montreal, and I'm curious about what those emerging threats mean to you in the community at large, as I say, some of the intersectional communities, and if you have any sort of specific issues regarding that, other threats and so on, and how do you protect yourselves from those?
I don't think there was enough questions in there.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to squeeze it all in.
So communities that I think are getting forgotten, I'm seeing a big change in bringing in a lot of Black folks in the queer community, but I feel like people of color, all spectrums of people of color. We're talking about Asian folks, Two-Spirit Indigenous folks. We're talking about other communities, because I feel like we make it very black and white, but there are a lot of different colors in between that are being forgotten. So I think that needs to be pointed out, and we need to make space for those folks as well, because I see representation for me in small parts, but for some communities, some racialized communities, not at all. And that's too bad, and I'm just really over that. When it comes to the far right situation, let's just say it how it is. I hate the glamified language of saying, oh, far right, these are people are basically neo-Nazis. They are neo-Nazis, they are creating hate. They are pushing forward with hate, and kids and teenagers are getting attached to it. Because when we use words like far right, we have the Ben Shapiros and Jordan Petersons who are creating hateful language, but putting it under the lens of being far right or fighting for men's rights and things like this. But we really need to point out what it is and what their intentions are, because I think when we don't specifically talk about people's intentions, people get through the cracks, and that is youth. I have been to schools where I have had teachers that have flagged students, that have had very curious behavior in the sense of very interested in World War II, then said that his father was part of Hitler's youth and wanted to do a research project on Hitler's youth, and just outlining those kind of things. So it's real and it's happening, and these youth are getting caught into this because they want a sense of community. This is why they are grasping for a sense of community, and they are getting it online from places where they shouldn't, and not understanding the difference between what is biased and what isn't. So I think really just exemplifying to people what the intentions of many of these groups are, and what is the intentions. And I see so much hope, but I also see little buds of hate around, and they're in schools, and they're in elementary schools, they're in middle schools, they're in high schools, right? But the kids don't understand it because people aren't using the direct language, they're using the kind of around the way language. So when we're more direct with them about what this means, who these people are, what is hateful language, what is the oppression, and what does it mean to be oppressed, and what does it mean to be an oppressor, right? And once they understand that, they can kind of better handle the future that we have for them, which I don't even know where it is right now. Yeah.
I think I've, said this a couple times, but I think, again, like, trans folks are one of those communities. I think that when it comes to, like, current issues, my issue is I'd like to be able to leave my house and not feel worried about my safety. Like I'm gonna die on that hill. It is like the basic ask of not having people yell at me, not having people throw slurs at me, not being harassed in public would be a really nice change of pace. Like a really, really, I would love that. But I don't like, and so I think that more than anything else, visibly gender nonconforming folks get a lot of shit in this world, especially when they're existing at other intersections as well. Like I think that we can't, if you haven't experienced that, I don't think you can know what it's like. I've had folks be like shocked when they walk down the street with me, like genuinely, like entirely shocked, because I don't think folks can quantify what that violence feels like, or realize how constant it is and what that impact has on you. In terms of like white supremacy and fascist organizing, I think we've deluded ourselves in terms of how bad it is, and I think that's part of how we got to ourselves to this day. When Trump got elected, everyone was like, Canada's not gonna do that, it's gonna be fine. And then we have Premier Ford, and then we have Jason Kenney in Alberta, and then we have Andrew Scheer, who's doing his whole thing federally, and that is because, in part, of our ambivalence towards the rise of fascist organizing. It is also true that we are seeing people like Jordan Peterson, who are emboldening these like disenfranchised young men in particular, looping into them, talking to them in a way that they understand, and that's actually something we're really bad at on our side of this issue. We are bad at talking in people's language. I do education and like advocacy media work, and they don't care about the word like cissexism. They don't care about the word systems of oppression. That is not language that relates to a disenfranchised white straight young man. And that is not a word that relates to a middle class cisgender straight woman who has a stable income and is pretty cozy. We need to talk about human rights. We need to talk about basic respect for decency and our right to live in a world where we're not harassed. Like these fundamental ideas, I think we get constructed as elitist when we use language that people don't understand. We cannot use language that people do not understand because it makes them feel stupid. It makes them feel like they are not in the loop. It makes them feel like these things are just weird gender studies student things, and that's not effective public education. And a lot of the disenfranchisement that I'm seeing is because of our failure to do good, broader public education. But I also think that it's really scary in the time that we're living in. I organized a rally against Ford's repeal of sex ed in 2018, and we had white supremacists and fascists show up and disrupt it in Ottawa in August of a year ago, a year and a week ago. We had folks who were trying to instigate violence against our protesters. We were lucky that we had some anti-fascist folks present in that space who are trained and able to counter those kinds of that kind of aggression. But that was the start, or one of the starts, of what we have seen. This Pride season has been marred with folks showing up to Toronto Pride, the whole mess that was Hamilton Pride. There was also folks in Burnaby doing this kind of thing. It happened right outside of Ottawa not that long, like days ago now, right? I think that we've been ambivalent to it, and I think that every single physical protester who shows up to our events, who shows up to protest our events, is connected to tens and tens and hundreds and thousands of people whose ambivalence has allowed a political culture where that person can say those things. And I don't know what to do about it.
In answering this question, in reading it, this is the first one that I knew what I was going to say, clearly. But I think it's important to keep in mind is that just because things are better doesn't mean that that's how they're supposed to be. And I think, like, when I first saw this question, speaking personally, my reaction was, as a Black person, and regardless of who's in power or which government's in charge, anti-Black racism is still ever present. And as a queer person, regardless of who's in charge, LGBTQ youth still have the highest rates of homelessness. Trans women, particularly trans women of color, still have the highest rates of sexual assault and violence and living below the poverty line. Regardless of who's in power, we still have queer youth that are still the highest suicide risk. And so I think it's a good question because we're living in perilous times for sure, but I think that, as queer people is that we always are skeptical, and we have to continue to be skeptical. It's wonderful that we have gay marriage. It's wonderful that we're seeing improvements in certain areas, but I think that we've gotten very comfortable and resting on laurels, and that's not enough. Gay marriage is not going to save us. Neoliberalism is not going to save us. We have to save ourselves. We've always saved ourselves. And I think whether, queer people in general and also, in specific circles, when you look at queer people of color, they've always had to fight. And we were fortunate enough to screen at Max Our Dance Revolution, a documentary I highly recommend. It's about the history of Black queer people in Toronto from the 1960s till present day. And it's a beautiful film, but I think it really speaks to that this need doesn't go away, no matter who's in charge. Nazis, whatever name you call them, they have always been here and they'll always be here. So we always have to be ever vigilant.
I always have more to say. I also think that, building off what you said, I think we got complacent around the major milestone victories. We have sexual orientation is protected in Ontario and Canada's Human Rights Code. As of 2017, C-16 was passed. Woohoo! Actual woohoo! That was amazing. But we affirmed trans rights, gender identity, and gender expression as protected in our Human Rights Act on the federal level, and we'd had it in Ontario since 2012. That was not new, and there have been changes, but at the end of the day, human rights legislation is reactive, not proactive. Human rights legislation means that if somebody beats me up on the street, oh great, I can charge you possibly with a hate crime, which is also one of the hardest crimes to charge somebody with. That doesn't actually do anything beyond reactive protection if people experience violence or experience employment discrimination, housing, that is important and that is good. Those take time. Those are not quick to do, and they do not actually stop those negative experiences from happening. And so we need to take a more substantive approach. We need to say, how do we address housing issues? What are the particular needs of LGBTQ young folks around housing and homelessness? How do we look at that? And so we need to not fixate on the easy victories, and they're not easy, they are not. Marriage equality was a nightmare. I can't even imagine what y'all did to help us get here. But they also don't deliver. Marriage equality doesn't mean that gay people aren't being beat up. Trans rights do not mean that trans folks don't have a terrifying rate of suicidality among trans young folks, where 47% of trans youth have seriously considered suicide in the past year. How do we move beyond rights and start thinking more about substantive policy change?
And I love what you said about being reactive, because then also when we have reactive policy, it's the idea of it is the responsibility of a person who is experiencing trauma or is traumatized to have to be their own advocate and work to get justice for themselves, when we should just be holding that as a standard. Yeah, so awesome.
I worked in homelessness for 9 years. And transgendered youth coming through homeless shelters was an awful situation, for sure, underserved. And we worked hard within our particular shelter and within our municipal shelters to try and find ways to, I'm going to say soften, but to find ways to protect and encourage people who needed our help, because we serve the homeless. That's our job. And we've worked really hard to do a lot more of that, but there's so much more that needs to be done. I don't have the answer either, but I just want to support that homeless youth is a huge number. The risk is ridiculous. And transgendered youth in homeless shelters suffer.
But luckily, the Youth Services Bureau is trying to change that very soon, so yeah.
And there are, I've done training with Youth Services Bureau a number of times now. The Ottawa Mission, which is, has historically, a few decades, was a religious organization, but is secular now. They are doing, there is some really good work to be done. But there's also histories of trauma and, generations of housing sectors and all of our social services causing violence and pain. And so there is always trust to be built. And none of them are doing it perfectly, but I am cautiously optimistic that the underfunded, underserved, homeless sector is going somewhere good. They just need more money to get more beds.
I just want to jump in. Vote.
Yes.
Well, that's a very short but good jump in. Thank you, Ben. And I appreciate the brevity because I am looking at the time. It's about 10 minutes to 9. If the panel is okay with that, and if the audience is okay, I thought what I would do is sort of squeeze one more question in, and then if we're okay staying a little bit later, I'll open up questions for about 15 or so minutes after 9, if that's okay with everyone. Is that good for all? Okay. So thank you. I mean, it's an embarrassment of riches and talent and intellect that we have here at the panel. I think that's why we are running late, is because there's so many important things that we need to talk about tonight, and hopefully this discussion will spark further discussion and more thought about some of these issues that we're talking about tonight. So I wanted to talk a bit about basically building something that Holly was talking about. That's sort of an initiative with OSPN and specifically with Justice in Action, is about sort of building alliances and partnerships. We talked a bit about how many organizations there are in the community. They're all doing sort of serving smaller pockets within the community, but we're not necessarily integrating as well as perhaps we could be to serve the greater community. And I'm wondering what your thoughts or suggestions could be in terms of making those partnerships and alliances work better for the community at large.
I actually find it horrifically surprising that in this age of technology and social media and easy communication that we aren't better connected. Like, I would love, and actually what I really wanted to do today was take this experience and what I've learned back to Picton and to teach and also to take the messages back and forth. And I don't get why we aren't using social media better to connect our communities, not just our members within Ottawa, but other communities, because that's where the real strength comes, in numbers.
I think, especially when I talk to folks who have been activists for a long time and that are older, they've just, like, you literally started things on phone trees. Like, imagine. Like, that's in a world where we have the World Wide Web, and I can put an event on Facebook and 100 people will say they're going, but 3 will show up. And you could do a phone tree and overnight have a crowd of people show up. I think that's the kind of thing that we need to focus on, is how do we build communities? Because we meet in spaces, we call each other on the phone, not just sending an email that gets caught up in all of my emails or gets sent to my junk mail, and then, or I forget to respond, or somebody else forgets to respond to me. Just getting on the phone and talking with somebody and saying, hey, let's meet and create an action plan for what we're going to do in the future, because that's how things get done, that's how things happen. And I feel like we're all very much so very busy, so we're like, you know what, I'll answer your email, we'll see each other, we'll plan stuff, we won't go even to see the space, we'll just like plan it there, and then everything falls apart. So I think if we really just sit down with each other and kind of have that community that was created for before and could create crowds of people, and we do that now, and we find ways to connect more and to create more connection with the folks that we want to reach out to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I agree entirely. I agree entirely. I also think, like, I was talking to some folks who were organizing in the Harris era. It's like when Premier Harris came into power and was like doing all of his terrible things to health and social services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they talked about like the way that they organized in Toronto, and they basically shut down the city. Like, they had massive protests, they had unions, they had organizations across sectors, they had the like gender-based violence networks. Like, folks were reacting and responding on a scale that I can't even like begin to contemplate now. And then I look at the reaction to Ford, where we've like tried, where we've had some success, like the fight against sex ed. didn't go as badly as I expected it to. That was decent. There were ways that things have gone our way some of the time, but I think that our organizing infrastructure is basically non-existent anymore. When Ford came into power, I didn't know who I should be talking to say, okay, like what do we actually do on a community level to push back, resist, educate the potential voters, make it so that the polls around a particular issue would go our way, and make an issue so politically deathly or poisonous that Ford wouldn't touch it. I don't think we have that infrastructure anymore. And I think a part of it is really like where are the call sheets? Political parties are great at this. They are great at getting phone callers who will sit down and spend 4 hours with pizza and maybe some wine and call 50 people, 60 people, 300 people and get them out. I've been organizing in Ottawa for like 4 years now, and we are really happy when we get 200 people out to a protest. 200 people is decent. But where are the thousands? How do we get those thousands? How do we create the people power to get people to do those phone calls, to get people to sign their names onto those call sheets, so that if we need to do a rapid response to something that the government is doing, or even if we're trying to not just react to something, but call to action on a particular issue, how do we bring out the numbers? Because I don't think we can at the moment, and I think that shows. I think our inability to do sustained, long-term, and growing campaigns means that we can't begin to respond to a right wing that is actually really terrifyingly organized, that is terrifyingly connected, and politicians who are more than willing to ride those wins and build off of that movement to get themselves electoral success.
I'd love to hear your answer to that question. What do we need to do to organize better? Because I understand, because I offered to bring my motorcycle gang group. Oh my God, we're a group, not a gang.
She outed herself, everyone.
To the Ottawa Pride, and I heard that you're not allowed to have motorized vehicles and we were not welcome. And I thought, are we no longer rebels? But please, answer his question. I'm sorry, her, they? They question. Because I would love to hear what you think we could do.
I'll get to your question in just a second. Does anyone else have any other thoughts before I run up and
Oh yes, and just like, if you think it, do it. And this is something that I am like working with myself even doing, is when I think of an idea or a community group or a support group that I think needs to be there, like taking the action to like reach out to the people that I need to reach out to make it happen. If there's something that you really want to see in your community, sometimes you just have to advocate for yourself and be the person that stands up and says, hey, how can I organize this? How can I do this? How can I make this happen? Because yeah, help me. Ask organizations, ask for help, because I think we all have so many amazing ideas, and then we're just like, but then it ends there. We need to really make ideas action, and it's something that's difficult to do, but it's like we all have to work towards doing that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to pass it to the audience member.
Hello, my name is Tom Wilkinson. First of all, I want to fess up. I'm here under protest because I would have loved to have seen that Tom of Finland film. And but I knew I've never attended one of these, mainly for a variety of reasons, because they bored me to death. I have a stutter, long time, and it only took my voice studies to turn that around. So this is I'm a newbie at one of these events. There have been, over the years, meetings such as this, maybe not quite the same dynamic, but they've been asking the same kinds of questions in different ways. But one of the things that people don't bother asking is, what is my part in this? Many people have burned out, and burnout is a huge problem. One of the things that came out of the Queer Edge meeting last night was the difference between assimilationists and activists. I got a call about 15 years from my middle brother. He told me, Tom, I saw what happened to you, and I didn't want the same thing happen to me. I thought he was talking about the violence that I went through at home. And there's that part of me that says, maybe it didn't happen. What it didn't dawn on me is what happened at school and the times in my reaction, and how many in this room would, in order to survive, would walk around the perimeter of the schoolyard because that was the only safe place to be. So what my brother, and we found out later with his now ex-wife, and the cookies to gay porn sites on his computer, are all the people who have witnessed abuse, said nothing, did nothing. And those are the people who are assimilationists, who wanted a piece of the pie, and whether you're francophone, whether you're, regardless of black or white, women, you suck it up in order to get a piece of the pie. And now that we remember the day, those of us are public servants, when our public service health insurance plan included us. And how many of us did a 360 in the room to see, to remember that moment when we read those words and we were finally. So now we've become, more and more of us, part of the haves. We're in this room with people who are latchkey kids. And for those of us who have not been latchkey kids, we have no idea what your world has been like. So all I'm saying is that there are a whole bunch, all the attention goes on to people who have been reacting to all the stimulus over the years with booze and drugs, food, work. Fabulous guy. Yes, he died of a heart attack, but he never said no. Gambling. Nobody's talking about the stuff that is going on in the parking lot at the casino. Or in front of, de la Carrière. And we think that the only people in our community are people who are addicts and don't realize that all those isms are not one people issues, that it takes the non-addict, who is often much sicker than the addict. So one of the things that happens to people who get involved in activist work, yes, is burnout. But as Malkins found, the Harvard professor and psychologist named, is that it's not just the extroverted narcissist, it's not just the introverted narcissist, which was a real revelation for me, but it's the communal narcissist that gets involved in this kind of despair work, as was called in the 80s. So unless we're talking about the things about who we are individually, our foibles and our strengths, there will always be burnout. There will always be people who need power in the gay community. There will always be people who will want to take hostages by making their problem everyone's problem.
I don't feel like I'm burnt out. I feel like I'm on fire.
Great.
And we all need to be on fire.
True.
But I do understand, I totally understand what you're talking about, in the sense of, if we don't help support each other, then many of us will face compassion fatigue, and sometimes the people that are sticking around are not always the people that we want to be the advocates for our community, right? So it's the idea that, yes, we need to support each other to make sure that we are checking in with our coworkers, checking in with our friends, checking in with our community members, to make sure to see how they are on a truthful level, and not just saying, hey, I'm fine, right? No, because most of us aren't fine. And setting boundaries and knowing that, if someone sets boundaries for themselves, that although much work needs to be done, these are their boundaries and we can't go past them, So that's how we have to do it. Because of course, we are not exempt from having people in our own community that are fighting for our community, but not doing it in the right way. But we need to make sure that we have enough voices around those people to say, hey, no, this is how we're going to get it done, or this is how we're going to do it. Because if we don't do that and we don't support each other, then there's nothing that can be done, right? And then we'll have voices speaking up for us that are not our community's voices. It is the voice of an individual, right?
Marie, did you have a question? Yeah.
Can I jump in with a quick thing?
Yes, sure. Yes.
I also think we have to have honest conversations about what I would actually describe as a high of the social capital that comes with community involvement. What I mean by that is I think that there aren't a lot of folks, there are segments of very visible community organizers or folks who have a profile, who have had access to the resources to be in the media, to be in the leadership of an organization, who've done some ongoing organizing, and I think that's we need those people to some extent, but we also need to be mindful of the social capital that they have. I have been organizing for a while. A lot of people recognize me to some extent, and that means that if I say something, people are more likely to listen to somebody than to somebody who hasn't run a protest. Or who doesn't write for media and all of those pieces. And so there's a thrill that comes from that, but there's also a need to check yourself in terms of both what is the actual underlying cause that you are fighting for, what is your actual goal and how is your work revolving around that, as opposed to continuing to build that profile to accumulate social capital and then maybe misuse that in some way. And so I think those conversations around how do we hold ourselves accountable when it's shifting from doing the work because the work needs to be done to doing the work because you really like how people treat you when you do the work. We're not good at that conversation. I think it's a really important one for us to have amongst ourselves.
Thank you. Okay, Marie, I think, has a question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marie from Ottawa Senior Pride Network, and I still have a fire in my belly, Patricia. I'm really liking what's happening tonight, but I just want to bring it back and make it a little bit more concrete here. And I think that it's fair to say that, I'm looking at my other people from Just I think we can take the lead here. We're talking about this being the beginning and having more conversations and having actual conversations, not online, but actually we have a meeting and we have wine and we have whatever, coffee or whatever we're doing. But we need to make that happen, and I just want to make a commitment, I think, from Just Act, okay, Chair and Co-Chair, that we will take the lead on that. So I want something to, this is great, and people are right that we've had these conversations many times, and then we get all excited, and then nothing happens. And so I'm just making a commitment from our committee that we're going to make something happen, and this will not be the end, and this will be the beginning of conversations that we need to have.
That's awesome. Thanks, Marie. Did you have a question? No? Okay. Sorry, did I hear? Oh, okay, yes.
Glenn,
and I'm
can
gonna.
I-
Did
can
you
I
have any
just-
questions from online as well? I wanted to make sure that we got some stuff there. Can I do that before I get back to you? Okay. Go for it.
All right, I'm just gonna zip through a few things. We have one like. Yay. I'm going to timestamp these so that we can actually maybe get a sense of when they were mentioned. So at 8:13, we had This is a Great Panel, and we also had And Daniela Just Nailed It. And at 2025, there was a Faye is Nailing It. At 8:01, there may be great value to get together to also put an ask together as service providers. Pride orgs are successful in lobbying, but imagine if 5 to 15 local groups collectively address City Hall funding. Is Jim Watson's calendar a bit more open now?
Just to touch on that, there is a letter that is being submitted to City Council in the next 2 or 3 days with a concrete ask for the city to engage in strategic planning process and do some sort of a town hall to identify priorities, and it has about 17 signatories at this point. It is not a public letter at the moment, but it is intended to begin conversations to get funding to do some of that initial town hall community engagement stuff, and then flow into a more concrete ask based off the gaps that would be identified to say, now we know what the problem is, please God give us money to do it, because this funding, this city gives a hell of a lot less money to LGBTQ organizations than Toronto does, than Vancouver does, than probably Montreal does, even when you factor in population. But it's happening.
Great. Okay, I'm going to get to your question in the audience. Oh, sorry, did you have something else you want to add? No, you're good? Okay, so I'm going to pass it on to Holly. She had something that she wanted to ask or say.
Thanks very much. So, Marie, so what you brought forward is exactly what I've been thinking. Number one, we had our OSPN forum, as I mentioned, last year. And our next step is doing strategic planning for Ottawa Senior Pride Network. And certainly the conversation here that's taped, that we're going to be able to look at and parse through, later on, we'll be able to look at, to think more about what you've all suggested here tonight. And it's going to be a very important part of how we look at, I think, our moving forward next steps. But certainly the Just Act Committee itself, as I said earlier, one of our main goals is to build allyship and to do, just to keep that moving and build momentum there. We know people have a lot of interest in doing it, but let's just get going. So this gives us a real a boost to do that. And I really appreciate everybody's articulate responses to things. And I'm so glad we are taping this for the future. So I think this is, we're learning as we're going as well. But this is an important event for us. And we're happy that it's happening before we do our strategic planning. I'm so glad to hear about people talking about strategic plans and policies and getting together, and the education aspect as well. I know, Patricia, in what you were doing in Prince Edward County, you did the protest, or you did what you did at the church, but you moved that forward. You took it to the institutions that need to be there to help keep building, and that's what we want to be doing. So thank you for saying that. I agree. And I'm not wrapping up. I want to say that you will be part of our strategic planning going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. I've got another question in the audience here.
Well, it's not really a question, it's more a rant. I've been doing this since the 70s. I was president of the Hamilton McMaster Homophile Association. The first time I went to a march in Toronto, I ended up carrying the lead banner. It was just after John Damien got fired. And the banner we carried was Job Security, a Gay Right. I also helped organize we called it the BC Provincial Gay and Lesbian Conference, but it was just Vancouver. And I'm going to go back a bit. The very first gay club I went to was called the Twilight Villa Social Club in St. Catharines. I'm from the Niagara Peninsula. I guess the point I'm trying to get at is the more opportunities we have to work and meet each other like this, the best thing about the Twilight Villa Social Club, Patricia, was we had butches and femmes, and the only people, there were two couples at that club who didn't fall into roles, and they were these two young women and two young men. Everybody else was in roles, but we had trans people, we had, it was just a lovely time. Cabaret, I still remember the cabaret show. Anyways, the more opportunities we have to meet people who aren't like us, even though we're all part of the queer community, is good. Because it allows us to see each other as human beings, and we'll stick up for each other, and we build that bond. We are not always going to get along. We are going to disagree. We're going to get angry. The number of times I didn't speak to people for a while. But you get over it because you realize that we are comrades. And that's what I hope we get out of this, and what I hope the Seniors Pride Network is able to do, is produce more opportunities for these sort of events. And, strategic planning is great, but we're still human beings first and foremost. And that's what I would like to see, is more getting to know each other as people. And, of course, addressing the inequities and challenging capitalism and, destroying capitalism, let's be straightforward. And those sort of important roles around gender and identity as well. But we're still people.
Thank you. That's great. I'll get to you in 1 second. I'm just looking at the time. Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts as we wrap up? Lucy has one. Okay, and you have one as well. Okay, so we'll try and get to those two, and then I think we'll wrap it up for this evening. We've had an amazing discussion, but I will get to those last two questions if that's okay. And I did want to mention Deborah is going to be our Vanna White here and mention that we have an evaluation form. So if you are interested in filling that out, it's available in French and English. We'd love to hear your input from tonight's discussion. Okay, so I'll go to you first.
Thank you. Hi. My name is Kate. I just moved here from East Vancouver, where I worked in the downtown east side as a support worker, mental health worker. I'm a harm reductionist. And I'm here tonight in the interest of community care. And that is what I feel people are screaming for in this room, energetically. That's what I feel in this room. And that's what I'd like to leave everybody with. That's my comment for tonight, I just want to put that into everybody's heads, because self-care is great. I've worked in mental health for a long time. It's lovely. It's wonderful. I am so sick of hearing about self-care. We cannot heal our communities only through self-care. We need to help each other, and that's what I'm really feeling tonight. I do have a question, and that is, for everybody in this room, what would community care look like for you? What would that feel like? What would you want that to be? Because I just got here and I'm lonely. And I cannot tell you what a pleasure it is just to be in this space with all of you, just to witness you, just to see that you exist. And I love the discussions we've had tonight. I've heard some amazing ideas. I see everybody just springing into action when we're talking about all the things we need to do. We need some energy to get to that point. We need some energy. We need to fill ourselves up. So enjoy Pride this weekend. I'll see you all there. And my question to you is, what would community care look like for you? And if you have an answer, please come talk to me, because I would love to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone from the panel like to address that?
Thank you so much for saying that, because I think it's so now we have this culture focused on self-care, take time for yourself, which is super important, but not if we're only focusing on an individual. We need to focus on the collective. Why do you need to take self-care time is not what we need to start focusing on, but we're not. So thank you so much for saying that. And yeah, what does community look like for me in the future? It's making connections here with you all. Like when this is over, I'm going to be sticking around, and I would love to talk to whoever wants to talk with me and make plans and make action, because that's what I'm trying to do. Because I am young in this room, but I am old, and every time I go into these schools with these kids, and I need to create a future for them and create organization and action for them that I can give and pass on to them. So I would love to get any questions, comments, talk, and just like start making change really lasting and real. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it on to Lucy.
It's great to hear everybody's energy. And what I want to say moving forward, which is, I think that there is as the sort of cesspool of fascism spreads, it's our absolute opportunity, because in the bad old days, everybody fought in one group because there was only space for one group. We got a few more rights. The groups separated. People were able to take more of them, care for themselves, and speak up for their own smaller groups. And we've gotten more separate, which has been powerful, and communities have built. But I think right now is the super magical opportunity for all those communities to come together and say, what the fuck? And stand up and move together. And so I think the timing of this is fantastic in terms of people wanting to. I'll just say really quickly, after the story hour thing, a call out went on social media for people to show up for security for the family picnic. And I ended up there with a bunch of bikers, straight bikers from Bikers Against Child Abuse. And there were, I think there were probably hundreds of people who came. I think there were more people outside the gate than there was inside the gate. And there were people from all over the place. There were straight allies. There were people from everywhere. There were sex workers. It was great. And I think that we all yearn for that community to a certain degree. And I think if an umbrella group in any way can be there again, or even I don't even know what it is because I don't have the answer, but the moment is ripe, and I think that people want it. And so go, everybody, go, go, go.
You know, Lucy, I just want to respond to that for a moment. The incident in Picton was a perfect storm. It was a perfect moment to be able to pull a willing community together. The allies were strong and eager to help and lead. And the council could not ignore a formal deputation from a strong community to have them stand and unanimously adopt it and work towards a charter of inclusion and equality within that community. So you're right. When the time is right, you need to take action. The time is right for us to take action.
Thank you very, very much. I am looking at the time, and I think it's probably time to wrap it up. Jay is reminding me a couple times tonight that Max Ottawa, actually, some staff were recommending that they're also interested in furthering more conversations. So not to put you on the spot, Robert, but your colleagues are saying that, so you're off the hook. It's them that's offering to do that for you. So I'm just going to quickly grab my speech and wrap up.
And I'm going to take this opportunity while you run to apologize to Faye for tripping over your pronoun. I feel badly about that, but I too am learning.
Thank you. It's very sweet.
So just in wrapping up, now that I've got the good mic again, I wanted to thank everyone really who helped make this evening possible. Again, that would be Capital Pride, the City of Ottawa, OSPN, and especially the Justice in Action Committee that I helped chair with Holly, and of course our 5 amazing panelists who did such a great job. So please give everyone a round of applause. Robert, you're right. Unfortunately, you're not getting paid. And so we appreciate the fact that you volunteered your time here tonight to offer, to give us your perspectives, to tell us your stories, and to tell how you're making significant differences in the community. As people in the audience were saying, we're thirsty for this knowledge and for this energy to sort of continue and to happen. So you're an amazing inspiration to us, and I just want to thank you very, very much for your time. It's really very much appreciated. And on a final note, just to say thank you to our audience, both online and here in the room tonight. I know it's a busy Pride Week. As you know, there was a Tom of Finland movie. There are other types of things that maybe sound a lot more fun, but to see the energy and enthusiasm for people to feel a need to get involved in building and rebuilding community, it's really great to see. So thank you very, very much for coming and joining us tonight. And I hope to see all of you during Pride Weekend. Thank you very much. Have a good, safe Pride. Get home safe.